So it would be correct to say that the nausea that Roquentin describes in the novel of the same name is a form of angst, is a form of dread. Something is wrong, but there's no specific thing to be afraid of. It's just that, well, it would be better to say, rather than something's wrong, everything is wrong. But what is it? Roquentin loses his grip on reality, and this is what important to us for the rest of our discussion today, meaning is not self-evident anymore. But if meaning is not self-evident anymore, this raises two further questions. First of all, can meaning exist at all? As you know, Roquentin describes it as sliding off, right? You try to put words on something, but they will not stick. So we can think up meaning, we can think up words, but if they don't stick to reality, is there any meaning at all? And if there is meaning, how, right? How is meaning possible if existence itself is basically indifferent to it, right? If words don't stick to things. So how is it possible, and where does it happen? Where does meaning originate? By now you know the answer to this second question, at least the where. Meaning seems to originate only in our mind. And there is meaning only, at least according to this philosophical tradition, there's meaning only because we create it, and we agree on it, and we communicate it. Without people, in other words, or without the kind of rational beings people are, there could be no meaning. Clearly, we need to look into this further. These questions about meaning tend to present themselves only when a larger framework falls away. Here, specifically, the framework of religion. As you can imagine, traditionally, sources of meaning have been ascribed to higher powers or found in higher powers. If, for example, you look at the Christian tradition, then you can see that these questions about existence, namely whether meaning exists and how we assign it, that these questions don't really come up or aren't really relevant because the source of meaning is given. In this case, the source of meaning is God. Now, conveniently, God, in this case, actually wrote a book. Or in fact, maybe he wrote two books, the Bible and the Book of Nature. Now, the Bible gives us actual words and puts them on things and gives us clear, well, that's open for debate, but gives us instructions. The Book of Nature in the Christian tradition is the other book God wrote in his creation. So, in order to understand this, think of nature as something created by God to also instruct us. So we need to look at nature, we look at the way things behave in nature, and again, I'm drawing here on a very traditional understanding of Christianity. We look at nature in order to derive lessons. How do the animals act, right? What do plants do? All of this God has created, and he has put us in the middle of it. And the starting assumption is that it is all meaningful. Why? Because God created it. So you see how these questions about meaning don't really get off the ground within a religious framework, or at least a religious framework that is adhered to. But as you can now start to understand, once these sources of meaning fall away, once these higher powers are no longer in effect or no longer believed in, then the source of meaning also disappears. It therefore is no wonder that somebody like Sartre, or the existentialist tradition that I've been referring to, has its heyday right after World War II. After World War II, the tremendous slaughter becomes known, right? People learn about the Holocaust, learn how many millions of people have died, and it's very hard to believe in a good God who also takes care of everybody, right, in the face of those atrocities. It is therefore a time for existential philosophers to say, well, if there is no God, or if God is radically different from what we thought, then perhaps we can also no longer ascribe meaning to him, her, it, right? But in this case, of course, him. And the only thing we have left is the meaning we assign ourselves. This idea that with the disappearance of the belief in a higher power, meaning also disappears, or at least taken for granted absolute meaning. This crisis is put into words by Friedrich Nietzsche in the book he wrote, The Gay Science, 1883. He famously said in it, God is dead, and we have killed him. What is the result of us killing God? Well, of course, he just means that we've killed God by stopping to believe in him. If nobody believes in him, he doesn't exist. This, at least, is what Nietzsche claims. Once God is dead, we are completely thrown back onto ourselves, and we have, as we've already seen, only ourselves and other people as sources of meaning. But who are we? Who are other people? These are all very imperfect beings, incomparable to the supposedly perfect God who before was the source of meaning in the world. So this, again, is terrifying. Because what is true now, says Nietzsche at least, this is another quote from him, the strength of knowledge does not depend on its degree of truth, but on its age. He says that in fact most things we hold to be true are simply the things we've longest believed in. So our habits, our customs tend to dictate what we hold to be true. Not because it actually is true, because there's no way to check. How could we ever know anything is true when we have thought it up? All we have is history, and things that we for a long time have held to be true just feel truer to us than new things. This may sound rather abstract, but you probably know this from personal experience. If you've been doing things a certain way for a long time, maybe there's a certain custom in your family, then that simply feels like the right thing to do. Not because it necessarily is the right thing to do, but because you're used to it. Nietzsche says that this principle, this habit, applies to most aspects of life. We tend to call true the things we are used to and that most people agree on. Not necessarily because they're true, but simply because we have become habituated to them. Once we realize this, though, once we realize that there is no absolute source of truth and meaning, this, of course, liberates us. This is a scary kind of freedom, though, because if God is dead, if there really are only meaning-creating people, then yes, we are absolutely free, but in addition to that, we are also completely responsible. There is no other source we can fall back on, no excuse along the lines of, well, God created me this way, or that's just the kind of person I am. No, we have radical choice and radical freedom, and with it, the responsibility to create meaning in the world. It's not there, we cannot take it for granted. If it is there, it's there because we make it so. The advantage of recording this without an audience is that I cannot see you not laughing at this, what I think is a pretty funny joke. So God is dead, so at least says Nietzsche. Whether we agree with Nietzsche completely or not, at the very least it is safe to say that our society is a lot more secular than it used to be. In other words, religion still plays a large role, but not as big a role as it used to. And according to Nietzsche and many other philosophers, sociologists, anthropologists, etc., with him, according to these people, science has, to a large extent, taken the place of faith. Now, there's a lot to say about that, and of course, much more than we can go into here. What's important for now is to see that our craving for certainty and our craving for meaning, our craving to have a grip on reality, leads us to look for truth, leads us to look for knowledge. Now, if that knowledge can no longer be found in an indisputable source, like, for instance, a higher power, then perhaps we can find it in this human-made thing called science. But what exactly counts as science? That is not an easy question to answer. We can, of course, talk about the scientific method, all kinds of abstract issues related to science, but as we know from our day-to-day experience and from reading the news, a lot of things pass for science these days that are not, and a lot of things that a lot of people think are science are dismissed by others as not scientific at all. You only have to think about the debate around global warming and sustainability to see how this plays out. So what counts as science, and what actually is scientific knowledge?